International climate policy foundations were laid in the mid-1980s, sort of culminated in the Rio conference in 1992. So I think we can say that for the last 20-25 years, governments have tried, and some of them have tried hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And you can rightfully ask the question, how successful was this? Now, to this audience, it shouldn't be a surprise that if you just look at the emissions record, you can't really see anything. Emissions have just continued to go up as if there was no climate policy. This is, of course, not a particularly fair comparison because a lot of these emissions come from countries that do not have at least a nominal climate policy. But if we focus on some of the countries that do have a climate policy, France, here in gray, Germany in orange, Japan in green, the United Kingdom in pink, as well as the United States in light blue. What you're looking at here is CO2 emissions per dollar value added. This is perhaps the most interesting metric. It tells you there has something fundamentally changed in the economy. For those of you who can't quite read the graph, it starts in 1970, runs to 2014. And you see that CO2 intensity of the economy has come down and has come down consistently and persistently over this period. But you can't really see a trend break in 1990. It just seems that the last 20 years were a continuation of the trends of the 20 years before. And this is true for the United States, where there's been some climate policy, but it's also true for some of the countries, Germany, Japan, United Kingdom, who have consistently claimed to be leaders in climate policy and claim to have done a whole lot to reduce their emissions. It's just not visible in the data. There's been more careful analyses of this than just eyeballing graphs, but the results are essentially the same. It does not seem to be the case that the last 20 years of climate policy have had a really big effect on our emissions. There has been a lot of climate policy, and definitely in Europe, climate policy seems to have been mostly about two things. One, about creating rents, and the second was about rewarding allies. A lot of money has changed hands, but the effect of this money changing hands does not seem to have been emission reduction. And there's another thing that I'd like you to draw your attention to. The way, definitely in Europe, we have done climate policy does not seem to be, even though there's still a strong public consensus that there should be climate policy, it doesn't seem to be particularly entranced in policy in the way that universal primary education is entranced, or old age pensions are entranced, in the sense that nobody is really objecting to this anymore. We quibble over details, but we don't question the fundamentals. That is not the case for climate policy. There's still a lot of debate about the fundamentals, whether we should be doing this at all. And the policy instruments that have been chosen are not the ones that would last for the decades or longer that we need to really decarbonize the economy. What we've seen in Portugal, Spain, the UK, is that the emphasis on subsidizing particular forms of energy do not really withstand the current austerity that these countries have to adopt to balance their fiscal position. And also the experience in Australia and the UK suggests that the sort of rent creation that has been going on is just not stable, not robust to elections. And if a new party comes in power, things change, and things change rapidly. In the UK, since the last election, there's sort of one renewable subsidy abandoned every week. seems to be the rate. Not a big bang as you saw in Australia, that all climate policy is nonsense and let's abolish it all in one go, but just one by one these policies are being dismantled. In Europe, or in the UK, this is much driven by a concern about wind turbines. Particularly the English public is very keen on its countryside and is beginning to develop a very strong distaste against wind turbines that spoil the landscape. In Germany, there is a lot of opposition against the cost of it all. And what you're looking at in this graph from 1998 to 2013 is not the price of energy, but rather the tax on energy, which, and this is the total, which went from 2.3 billion euro per year to $31.6 billion per year. That's a 15-fold increase in the space of 15 years. And the German public is beginning to get fed up with this. Doesn't seem to have done a whole lot with regard to emissions. German emissions have not come down as much as some people expected, and in recent years they've gone up again. And the reason for that is Fukushima. When the tsunami hit the nuclear power plant in Japan, the Germans thought we are vulnerable to tsunamis as well, and we should close our nuclear power plants just to make sure that this doesn't happen. You still need baseload, so coal, and not just coal, but also a lot of lignite, has actually taken over the generation of baseload power in Germany, and that is why emissions have now gone up, despite the costs of energy also rising very, very rapidly, despite enormous amounts of green subsidies, as well as taxation of fossil fuels. So where is this all heading? For those of you who are not quite familiar with Europe, there is a thing that I call the Grand Bargain. And as part of the Grand Bargain, the northwest of the European Union, that is the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, Scandinavian countries, essentially they have imposed their environmental agenda on the whole of the EU. Now you may wonder, why would other countries in the EU accept this? No, very simple. The southern countries, the Mediterranean countries, have been admitted into the euro. And the Eastern European countries, who are not very keen on environmental policy or climate policy or anything like that, have got a lot of structural funds in return. It's essentially a form of internal development aid within the European Union. But that grand bargain is unraveling at the moment. You are familiar with the euro crisis, no doubt. That takes away one vital plank of the grand bargain. And at the moment, there is a lot of debate about refugees and what to do with them, refugees from the Middle East in particular. And that is straining the old deal, because now we are asking the Eastern European countries to take in a lot of Syrian refugees, and they will want something in return. And one of the things they will want in return is less strict environmental policy. We've also seen that attempts to what people call fixing the European Union's emissions trading scheme have essentially failed. I don't really understand why it needed to be fixed. The EU ETS delivered the emission reductions that the European Union set out to achieve at the lowest possible cost, actually at minimal cost. What is not to like, right? You meet your targets, you don't impose any economic pain, but a lot of environmentalists dislike the low prices and said this needs to be fixed, but that actually has not happened. The interventions that are there sort of exist on paper but don't do a whole lot. Recently you will have noticed that there was a bit of a scandal around Volkswagen and what it did with its NOx emissions. Volkswagen was really confronted with a fundamental problem, and that is that it wanted to sell cars that are really carbon efficient, that don't emit a lot of CO2 per mile traveled, but it also had to reduce its NOx emissions and its particulate matter emissions. You you can't really do that. So they decided to sacrifice their PM emissions, essentially their NOx emissions. Found out. And now they have to change this, and that essentially means that a crucial plank of the European Union's attempt to reduce emissions was the switch from gasoline to diesel. That is now coming apart. Because either we have to abandon diesel engines altogether, or we have to make these diesel engines compliant with NOx regulations, and that means that they won't be nearly as fuel efficient as they used to be, right? And that is taking apart a big plank of Europe's climate policy at the moment. The deal that they've agreed with, I don't know how closely you follow the news, is that for the next 3 years it is fine to put all this particulate matter into the atmosphere and kill a few hundred or perhaps a few thousand Europeans more. That's the agreement that has been reached. I'm going to take you through 3 more countries, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Paris. Number of you will have seen this graph. This is Modi's plans for India's climate policy. Essentially, it's a bit like Bush. He promised to do less than what you would expect the market to achieve. So India is not particularly serious about climate policy. China makes a lot more noise. I would argue that clean air and abundant water is what their environmental policy should focus on, but also talk about climate policy a lot. And they have been for a long time. And for a long while, China seems to be going back and forth between will we have a carbon tax or will we have tradable permits? But over the last year, perhaps year and a half, it seems to be that they have settled on tradable permits as the instrument of choice. I think unwisely. And there's of course the theoretical objections that you would have to tradable permits over taxation, but there's also practical objectives. What you're looking at here are some numbers of energy use in China. And what you see is very substantial revisions of the estimates of energy use, including coal, one of the biggest emitters. And here we see the same thing for its emission numbers, where not even the official statistics tally up in China. And of course, there's no reason to believe any of these numbers. But the provinces and the federal government seem to disagree about how much China actually emits. Now, this is bad enough if we're talking about just emissions accounting, how much did China emit? That they can't seem to agree on a number, right? It's worse if you actually want to tax this, because if you don't know how much you are emitting, how are you going to tax something? But a tax is essentially a transaction between a company and its government, right? And somebody will take the blame if the numbers are not quite right. But if you use shaky numbers like this as a basis for a property right in a market where different parties are selling this and then others have to take this at face value and may sell it on, if you can't monitor your emissions properly, how can you define a property right that can be traded for real money? It just doesn't seem to add up for me. Final country, and I hesitate to speak about the US in a room full of people who know much more about this country than I do. I noticed that the US climate policy, there's not been any primary legislation, and most of the policy has been done by executive order, as well as some reinterpretation of legislation that was meant for completely different things. The problem with doing policy by executive order is, of course, that executive orders can be reversed at the stroke of the pen by the next president. So a lot of US climate policy depends on the outcome of the next elections, right? This morning we talked a bit about the social cost of carbon. What you're looking at here in the graph are essentially the dots are the estimates of the social cost of carbon that were published in the particular years that you see at the bottom, and then the lines are sort of the position of the literature until that point, and the thick black line is the median of the literature. And what the US did, or the federal government did, between 2010 and 2013 is double the social cost of carbon. And if you look at the median of these studies over time, and you compare 2010 to 2013, there doesn't seem to be a basis in the literature for doing this. And yes, it is true that around that time there were a few excited studies that suggested that previous estimates of the social cost of carbon were too low, but the bulk of the evidence suggests no. And if you actually compare the studies that were published just before to the published that came later, that concern seems to have gone away. And the social cost of carbon is, you don't need reminding, I would think, is terribly important in federal policy, because it essentially determines all the cost-benefit analyses that they're doing, and it essentially, through that, determines the plate efficiencies of all your appliances in the future of your cars and your trucks, as well as your power plants. So it is a terribly important number, and it needs to be set very, very carefully, and I'm not convinced that the Interagency Working Group in 2013 did it as carefully as perhaps they could have done. So let's look a bit forward at Paris. And of course, we know that since the collapse of the Copenhagen agreements, negotiations in 2009, countries have repeatedly said, and in 2015, we will reach a new deal. Now it is 2015, and in a few weeks' time, people will start gathering in Paris to come up with that new deal. And what will happen. And of course, you've also seen the media getting very, very excited about this. The fundamental point, greenhouse gas emission reduction is a public good, a global public good, in the sense that if you reduce your emissions, you will bear the cost, but the benefits of your emission reduction will be spread over the world. So you won't reap the full benefits, but only a small fraction of that. And that means that it's always in your best interest, in your self-interest, to let others take the lead, right? And just based on first principles, you could say that any international treaty on greenhouse gas emission reduction will be very hard to negotiate. There's two papers in the early 90s that just confirm that. And that is exactly what we've seen, right? Since the negotiations in Rio in 1992, not much progress has been made. As an academic, right, this is good news. Economists made a prediction, and the prediction came true. As a science communicator, I think we should feel bad, right, because it's pretty obvious that our prediction that this would fail was not taken to heart, and they tried anyway. And as a taxpayer, I think we should be dismayed that so much resources have been wasted on what has ultimately proved to be a futile effort. My calculations are that on the international negotiations alone, we spend about $100 million per year on just sending people to places like Paris, for no apparent reason than to keep these people well-traveled. Now, the economic fundamentals will tell you that international negotiations on binding targets and timetables will fail, and we have seen that happen. That does not mean that we are incapable of providing public goods, global public goods. And if you look at other global public goods, how are they provided? And you can take an example of combating a pandemic or sending a peacekeeping mission somewhere. Essentially what happens there is that we identify the need Then we go around with a begging bowl, and some people contribute money, other people contribute troops or doctors or nurses, and that is how we fund and provide for these things. And that is what we now see happening in the climate negotiations as well. The 2014 COP in Lima introduced intended nationally determined contributions to greenhouse gas emission reduction, and that is essentially pledge and review. Countries go back, decide what they want to do, announce it, and then we all get together in a major jamboree and say, is this enough? Do we want to do more? But the key part, the key deviation in Lima from the previous negotiations is that these are nationally determined. These targets are set by processes that are deemed legitimate within the countries that set these targets. It's not something that is imposed from the United Nations down. Today, was it the 30th of October, a few weeks before the negotiation starts, indeed all major countries have announced their targets. So in that sense, there's nothing to negotiate over in Paris anymore. The targets have been set. The discussion last week in Bonn and the other preparatory meetings are all about money. Essentially, how much do the rich give to the poor? That is what the negotiations are about at the moment. It has been about that since the very start. This is an old game, but the dynamics now have changed, right? And the main thing that is off the table is that Europeans are no longer paying the Africans to beat up the Americans to go for higher targets, because the targets have been announced, right? One of the main reasons why greener countries want to bribe poorer countries to convince browner countries what to do, that is off the table. Dynamics have also changed in other ways, that relative to the world economy, the poor are now much richer. We've seen China and India rise in all sorts of different ways since the start of the negotiations. And of course, the major donors for this sort of bribes, that is Europe and Japan, have suffered austerity and will continue to suffer austerity for at least another decade. And that means that there's less need to talk about money, but there's also just simply less money on the table. I don't think a whole lot will happen in Paris. And I don't quite know what all those 50,000 people will do there. All the major countries, as I said, have now unilaterally announced their emissions targets. Lo and behold, this came out earlier today. This is from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, where they're comparing the promised emission cuts in yellow to the baseline in black and to the blue, and that is what the IPCC said needs to be done to have a reasonable chance to stay below 2 degrees centigrade global warming. And what you see is that two things have not happened, right? One, the pledge that emissions should peak in 2020. That's not what these announced targets will do, right? You compare the yellow block around 2020 to the one around 2030, you see that the promises are that emissions will continue to rise. And the other thing is that we're getting further and further from the stated 2 degrees goal. And David Victor has said, I think rightfully, that Paris will be the funeral of the 2 degrees target.